Greetings everyone, and welcome back, and thank you again for tuning into this channel. Excuse the quality here of this video. I don't have the lights and everything set up right now. This is just the introduction to what you're about to see. For those of you who don't know who I am, haven't really followed the channel, my name is Keith. I was born a Jehovah's Witness. I was raised in the religion as of June the 7th of 1971. It was all I ever knew in regards to religion and spirituality and all that. I was taught that, anything outside of the religion is of Satan and all that, and I grew up believing that. Because number one, that's what my dad taught me. When we're kids, we trust our parents and we believe every word they say, and we just don't believe that they can steer us wrong by any means. But then when we become adults, we begin to see things for ourselves and begin to learn things. And this is basically the result of that. What I'm doing here on this YouTube channel is I'm just sharing my testimony. I was confined inside my head, believing one way, and as time progressed, God began to reveal to me and show me things that made me question what I had been taught from birth. And it ultimately led me out of the religion. I do believe that it was a divine intervention in my life that led me out, and that's the purpose of this channel. I want to share with everyone what God did in my life as He planted the seeds and put me in certain situations around certain people and got seeds planted into my head that eventually led to me being able to think for myself. We know that the religion, they don't allow their members to think for themselves. The governing body has to do all their thinking and interpretation and everything for them, and that's what we're going to talk about some in this video. But we're on part 7 of my testimony. This is the part, the testimony part of this channel is where I'm sharing what God did. I'm laying the foundation in my life. I want to make sure I want to drive it home and make sure everyone understands where I was at in my mind and what my thinking was at different stages of my life. And I'm building the foundation because I'm very close to the part where I began telling you and sharing what God did, how I began to wake up from the slumber that is known as the Jehovah's Witness religion. And but nonetheless, we're very close. So today we're going to talk about the years 1987 to 1993. There was a very traumatic event that took place in 1987. I don't ever want to go through it again. I'm also going to discuss 1989. There was an event that took place in 1989. I believe that there was a divine intervention at the just the right moment in which my life was spared. I do believe that God intervened and spared my life, and I'm sharing that story here in this video as well. We're also going to talk about the year around 1993 where my daughter was born, and of course my dad. Again, we want to believe everything that our parents tell us. And my dad had contacted me and told me something in regards to the tribulation, and it absolutely scared the daylights out of me. So we're going to go from 1987 to 1993 today. In the next video, you're going to hear about one of those seeds that was planted in my head, one of those very first seeds that was planted in my head that had me starting to think for myself. You're going to hear about that in the next video in part 8. I know right around 92 or 93, I was really, confined within myself, had nowhere to turn, couldn't turn to the witnesses, couldn't turn to the world or what have you. And around that time, I had this thought pop in my mind out of nowhere. And I do believe that it was one of the very first times that God was beginning to plant seeds. I had this very authoritative thought pop in my head. And it asked me a question. It said, what will you do if later you find out that everything you've been taught about religion was not true? I just had that thought out of nowhere one day, and I just felt like there was something different about that thought, although I couldn't explain it because I certainly didn't know anything about the Holy Spirit or believe in the Holy Spirit or anything because of the Jehovah's Witness teachings on the Holy Spirit. Surely the Holy Spirit would never talk to me. He only talks to the governing body, right? Well, we're going to get into some of that in this video and the next. Let's go ahead and get this one started. I don't like to I don't like the introductions to be too long because I know people get bored with them. So let's get started. I'll see you in video number 8. March the 1st of 1987 was and still is the single most traumatic day of my entire life. It was a Sunday morning, and somehow my brother Vince and I managed to escape attending the Kingdom Hall that particular day. Vince had turned 17 years of age the previous November, and at the time I was 15 years old with a difference of 17 months between our births. Vince had recently dropped out of school and began working full-time at a local sawmill, and in the process managed to purchase a very used but dependable vehicle all on his own. He wanted his own car because he had grown weary with the control that our dad exercised over the vehicle he had provided for Vince to drive. This meant that Vince's previous vehicle was then transferred to me, and I definitely wasn't complaining. This particular morning, around 10 a.m., at the same time the Kingdom Hall meeting was starting, Vince was in the front yard loading his 50cc motorcycle into the trunk of his car. He was preparing to spend the day with his fiancée as they had planned to go joyriding on his mini dirt bike and spend the day together. But this would by no means be an ordinary day. As I tinkered with the stereo in the 1971 Camaro I would now be taking possession of, Vince made me an offer I could not refuse. He explained that he was asked to bring something to drink to his friend's house, and if I would trade him my unopened 3-liter bottle of Pepsi, he would give me his fairly new Pioneer brand 6x9 car stereo speakers. He didn't have to ask me twice, and we finalized the deal. I then stood in the front yard as he drove off, having no idea that a tragedy was looming. As I finished tinkering with the car, shortly after stepping into our home, I received a phone call from a good friend who lived just up the street. He said his dad had purchased him a computer and he was inviting me over in order that we could play video games together. We had been mostly shielded from video games all of our lives, therefore I jumped at the opportunity, kissed my mother goodbye, and began to walk to my friend's house. After indulging in video games for about 4 hours, I then began my trek back home. The trip was about approximately 1 mile, and I arrived at our house about 20 minutes later, around 3:30 p.m. The first thing I noticed were the grocery bags still full of groceries that were left all over the countertop. This was very uncharacteristic of my parents. Soon, I realized that no one was home. Still curious, but not too concerned, I sat down in the living room and turned on the TV. About 20 minutes later, as I was still alone, our phone rang and I answered it. It was a brother from the Kingdom Hall that oddly seemed very surprised that he was speaking to me. He asked me if everything was okay, and I answered yes. He then proceeded to tell me that he was just informed that I had been killed in an accident earlier that day. I laughed at him as I explained that I was fine, and suddenly, in that moment, I remembered that I was home all alone and there were many things inside the house that didn't make sense. As the brother continued to inquire concerning an accident he had heard about, he explained that someone told him that a garrison boy had been killed earlier that day. My heart sank and my anxiety level went through the roof. Still all alone and just 15 years old, I now knew that one of my 6 brothers was dead, but I didn't know who it was or how it happened. I ended the call with the brother and paced the house back and forth, having no idea what to do. Approximately 20 minutes later, I saw a vehicle turn quickly into our driveway, and soon after that, my older brother Marty drove up as well. I recognized the driver of the first vehicle as being a sister from the Kingdom Hall. Marty and this sister met at the fence and began speaking to one another. I immediately stepped outside in hopes of finding out what was going on. They were both speaking of Vince in the past tense, making statements like, "He will be resurrected in the new order." At that moment, I insisted that someone tell me what was going on. The sister then took me by the hand. She looked me in the eyes and she said, "Keith, Vince was killed today in a train accident." Words cannot describe how I felt in that moment. The brother that I had shared a room with ever since the day I was born was now dead. My parents had received the call earlier that day. Upon arrival at the hospital, they were informed that he had been transported straight to the morgue. My mother went in and identified the body because my dad could not bring himself to do it. As the evening progressed, many friends from the Kingdom Hall arrived at our home, and our parents eventually returned around 9 p.m. Our pharmacist opened up his store late that night in order to fill a specific prescription our poor mother needed in order to calm her nerves. The next day, my parents began preparing for a funeral. Of course, Vince was given a Jehovah's Witness funeral, and the elder that he was specifically named after officiated the service. Brother Vincent assured us all that Vince was dead and conscious of nothing, and he would surely be resurrected into the new system of things. Brother Vincent also assured us that if we all remained faithful to Jehovah, we had the assurance of seeing Vince once again. And the service just wasn't complete without everyone in attendance being given a crash course concerning the Jehovah's Witness organization. Later, my dad would proudly say, "Well, there is at least one of my 11 children that I know for sure will make it into the new order." Referring, of course, to the earthly resurrection hope. On Wednesday, March 4th of 1987, my brother Vince was buried at Jordan Cemetery located here in Pensacola, Florida. For the first time in my memory, our family came together and was united, although it didn't take long and the dysfunctionalism that comes with large families reared its ugly head and division was once again the norm. Every year on the anniversary of his death, I would relive March the 1st of 1987 over and over in my head. It would take about 12 to 15 years before the anniversary of the most traumatic day of my life would become just another normal day. I turned 16 years of age on June the 7th of that same year, 1987. I started my 10th grade year of high school the following August. Just a month later, on September the 24th, I took a part-time job at a local grocery store as a bag boy. The assistant manager was also an associate pastor at a local church, and upon finding out that I was in the Jehovah's Witness faith, he wasted no time assuring me that my deceased 17-year-old brother was burning in hell. My brother had only been dead for 6 months, and the emotional trauma was still weighing heavy on my mind. I opted not to respond to such a cold-hearted statement for fear of losing my job. That year I signed up to take Art 1 the first semester of my 10th grade year. In addition to drawing and painting and all of the typical art class activities, our art teacher, Miss Q, as we were instructed to call her, would also require us to take written tests each week. We were required to study the history of art, among other things, and then we were given these written tests. I was raised from birth to believe that education was not as important as serving Jehovah, and that all publications not produced by the Jehovah's Witness organization was of Satan's system of things, including public school books. The result was that every time I studied for a test or made any positive efforts towards my education, I would feel condemned by Jehovah and truly felt as though I was displeasing to him. Therefore, academically, I would simply do just enough to get by. I barely passed Art 1 during first semester. Being a decent artist couldn't compensate for the low test scores due to lack of studying. On the first day of second semester in January of 1988, I stepped into Miss Q's class once more. First semester subject was Art 1. Second semester was Art 2. As I entered the room and took my seat, I quickly noticed that most of the students in the room were the same students I shared Art 1 with during first semester. No sooner than I walked in the door and sat down, Miss Q called me up to her desk. The room was now very quiet as every eye was now focused on me as I was about to be humiliated in front of the entire classroom. Miss Q proceeded to write me a hall pass to the guidance counselor's office. As she handed me the pass, she then explained to me that I was the laziest student she had ever taught, and she would not be allowing me to participate in her class during second semester. I had always been a very shy and quiet kid. I never caused trouble, and I made it a point to avoid it. Miss Q had no idea as to what was actually going on inside my head concerning my upbringing, and dismissed me as simply being a lazy student with no desire for success. The truth is, the more I studied resulting in good grades, the more I actually believed that Jehovah hated me. I had now started second semester of 10th grade, and the more I thought about eventually graduating, the more condemned I felt inside. I genuinely believed that on graduation day, Jehovah God would strike me dead. I felt absolutely humiliated and embarrassed in front of all of my friends. The following weekend, I talked my dad into allowing me to drop out of high school. I knew full well that as long as I convinced him that I would now be spending more time in field service, he would have no objection to my request. After sharing his desires for me to join the ministry school and for me to begin giving talks, he assured me that he would sign all paperwork in order for me to drop out of school. I assured him that serving Jehovah is exactly what I would do. The truth is, I had no intentions of participating at the Kingdom Hall in any way, shape, or form, and I was looking for an escape. The weight of the continuous condemnation, nonstop condemnation, had taken its toll, and I no longer had any desire to serve Jehovah. I had been programmed from birth to believe that without governing body assistance, I could never comprehend or understand anything, therefore attempting to obtain an education would be pointless. I was taught that everyone and everything existing outside of the Jehovah's Witness organization, including non-Jehovah's Witness publications, were of the devil. I couldn't pick up a magazine inside of a grocery store without the thought that Jehovah hated me even more popping into my head. The truth is, Satan had me right where he wanted me. In my mind, I was isolated. I had no one to turn to. I couldn't turn to the world because they were of Satan. I couldn't turn to the witnesses because I couldn't measure up to their expectations concerning righteousness obtained by works. I asked my store manager if I could be moved to the overnight stock crew. This would have me working overnight at least 3 to 4 nights per week and mostly sleeping during the day. This provided me an escape from Kingdom Hall attendance, which resulted in a temporary haven from some of the condemnation of feeling like I could never please Jehovah and measure up to his demands for righteousness that could only be obtained by faithfully serving in and remaining in subjection to him through his earthly organization, which I was convinced was the source of my anxiety, hopelessness, and severe depression. Although work provided an escape from attending the meetings, I could never escape the condemnation taking place inside of my head. I had decided to enjoy life as best I could and accepted that my ultimate destruction at Armageddon for no longer serving Jehovah would eventually take place. I was simply living a life of total hopelessness. Eventually, in the fall of 1989, I obtained my high school diploma from Pensacola Junior College. Although I was convinced in my heart that obtaining it would likely lead to my ultimate destruction at Armageddon, it would prove to be necessary if I had any hopes of obtaining a full-time position related to employment. On October the 14th of 1989, I attended a high school football game with 2 of my worldly friends. Around 10:15 p.m., I dropped them off at their homes and drove to a convenience store located about 4 miles from my residence. After leaving the store, as I drove home, enjoying my Coke and my candy bar, I failed to realize that I had placed my car into low gear. As the engine began to strain, I reached down and gripped the gear shifter located between the bucket seats of my 1983 Mercury Capri. As I attempted to place my car into the proper gear, the shifter went beyond drive and slipped past neutral all the way into reverse. Prior to making this mistake, I had reached approximately 45 to 50 miles per hour, and I was now approaching a small bridge. The wheels immediately locked up and the tires began screeching. I could see that the car was immediately skidding sideways and I was heading straight for the guardrail. The car impacted head-on into the guardrail and then flipped over the rail and rolled end over end twice before landing on its roof facing back in the direction I was driving from. As fast as it began, it was over. From the moment the accident began, without even thinking about it, I began shouting and begging Jesus to save me. I was still screaming the name of Jesus as the car came to rest on its roof. I climbed out with only a few scratches on my leg. We had no cell phones back then, and I knew my parents were sound asleep in their room, nowhere within the sound of a phone. First responders arrived and made sure I was okay. I still had not been able to reach my parents. Eventually, a soft-spoken, peculiar-acting man arrived on the scene. He looked down at the vehicle, and then he looked at me and said, "Young man, Jesus wants you to know that he was with you tonight." I then learned that he was a preacher. Since a so-called Christian preacher had told me just 21 months earlier that my deceased 17-year-old brother was now burning in hell, I wanted nothing to do with this man. The next morning, while examining the car in the daylight as it was sitting right side up, I was astonished at what I saw. The roof of the Mercury Capri was bent down the middle and caved in a V-like pattern. The driver's side of the roof was in a position in relation to where my head should have been, that had I been there, my neck would have been broken or I could have been decapitated. The inertia of the forward impact should have thrown me forward. Had this happened, my head would have been pinned between the roof and the top of the steering wheel. But as I screamed for Jesus to save me, something happened inside of this car during this accident that can only be explained as divine intervention. Stay with me, folks. As the front of the car impacted the rail of the bridge, instead of catapulting me forward, which should have resulted with my head being pinned between the roof and the steering wheel, the driver's seat I was sitting in broke backwards. My upper body was then pulled backwards into the left rear seat. After rolling end over end as the car came to rest on its roof, my upper body was in a reclining position laying in the safety of the back seat. As the car came to rest on its roof, my body never came out of the seat, falling forward and hitting the roof. Without question, God spared my parents from losing their second child within a 3-year period. Many years would go by before I would come to a full realization that a true miracle had taken place that night. For the next 2.5 years, I remained working at the grocery store and continued in my attempt to live a somewhat normal life, resolving within myself to have absolutely nothing to do with religion. I wanted nothing to do with Satan's earthly system of things, all the while feeling condemned for not serving in Jehovah's one and only so-called true organization. I felt as though I was somewhere stuck in the middle between Satan and Jehovah, and I was convinced that both were sources of my misery. The continuous torment of feeling condemned, hopeless, and being rejected by Jehovah stayed with me and never went away. I continued to accept my ultimate fate that Jehovah would eventually have enough and destroy me. Many times as a child, I remembered being told story after story of witnesses turning from Jehovah and then suffering tragedy after tragedy. Some even being killed by Jehovah himself. My dad had always told me that if I grow up and marry a non-witness, my marriage would never last. In June of 1992, I married my so-called worldly girlfriend. In January of 1993, my daughter was born. I had been very excited for the previous 9 months as I anxiously anticipated the day of her arrival. Over and over, I would imagine what it would be like to finally get to hold her. On January the 13th of 1993, that day finally arrived. I stood next to the hospital bed and watched as my little girl made her grand entrance into this world. In the hours leading up to her birth, the enemy had been tormenting me with negative thoughts. What if we lose her at birth? What if she is born dead? What if she is born with defects? Those were just a few of the tormenting thoughts that had been raging inside my head. Within seconds of her birth, the doctor announced that she was a perfectly healthy baby girl. The relief I felt was overwhelming, and I began to cry pretty heavily. I was crying so hard that the nurse had to ask me if I was okay. At this particular point in my life, I had pretty much turned off all of my emotions due to convincing myself that no one really cared about me anyway. The crying caught me off guard, and I could not explain where it was coming from. As the nurse proceeded to clean her up, I could not take my eyes off of this small, beautiful creation. As I stood over her, just admiring this little blessing, I remained very emotional. I could not believe that I was now a dad. I had always been taught that Armageddon would take place well before this would ever happen. For the first time in my life, I was experiencing something that had long been void in my life. Although I did not recognize it at the moment, I was being introduced for the first time ever to unconditional love. In all of my 21 years on earth, I had never known love without conditions. 2 days later, we were able to bring our baby girl home. That same night, my dad showed up at our mobile home unannounced. As I greeted him at the door, the first thing I noticed was that he had an attitude towards me. I had not married within his so-called truth, and now I had brought a baby into this world with a non-witness wife. It was obvious that he was not pleased. He stepped into the trailer with a Polaroid camera and took a few pictures of our newborn baby girl as she slept in her bassinet. The entire time he was inside of our home, he remained very distant and had very little to say. No sooner had he arrived and snapped his photos, he was gone. About 2 months later, as I was carrying my little girl on my shoulder, I received a phone call from my dad. President Bill Clinton had ordered airstrikes in the Balkans, and my dad was calling to let me know that Armageddon was once again imminent. The condemnation and hopelessness that I had carried all of my life from birth instantly rose up within me, and I was now very scared once again. What business did I have bringing a baby into this world, only to watch it get killed at Armageddon because neither of its parents were Jehovah's Witnesses? After disconnecting the call with my dad, I sat down on my bed, still holding my 2-month-old baby girl. I pulled her off of my shoulder and held her in front of me. I felt so ashamed for bringing her into this world, only for her to experience the same condemnation and hopelessness that I had dealt with all of my life. As I held her in my arms, I looked her in the eyes and I apologized, and I told her that I was very sorry for ever bringing her into this world. I still had nowhere to turn. I could never turn to anyone on the outside for help because I had been taught from birth that that would equate to turning to Satan. I couldn't turn to the witnesses because I truly believed it was too late. Therefore, Jehovah would never forgive me for leaving and accept me back into his organization. My dad told me that the airstrikes in the Balkans, ordered by Bill Clinton, was the start of the tribulation, and it was now too late for anyone to come back to Jehovah. And I believed it.